We should have a podcast called Three Bearded Journalists.
No, I was about to say we've got three beards here. This is
Yeah.
the Washington Post, three gray beards.
Rugged Latinos.
Two rugged Latinos and a Balkan man. That's what you
perfect.
got here. This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm Damir Marusic, an assignment editor, and this week we're talking about Trump, the U.S. Mexico relationship, and how people are feeling on both sides of the border. Trump famously promised mass deportation of 11 million undocumented immigrants, many of whom come from or through Mexico. Then, last week, he threatened to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican imports, something that would severely strain the U.S. relationship with our southern neighbor. Underneath all the drama, there are millions of real people who feel threatened and anxious about what's to come. I'm joined by two of my colleagues to discuss how all of this is playing out.
I'm León Krauze. I write about Latin American politics, Mexican politics, and of course, immigration for the Washington Post.
I'm Eduardo Porter. I am now in Brooklyn, but I spend half my life in Mexico City. I write about a lot of things for the Post, both as a columnist and a member of the editorial board.
León, let's start with you. You've been very concerned about the possibility of another Trump term for Latinos in the United States. Now that he's won, how are you feeling? And how are the families that you know or have reported on, how are they preparing for what's been threatened by the incoming administration?
I'm very concerned, Damir. The stark reality of the situation is that life for millions of people has already changed. I mean, during my years working as a reporter in Los Angeles, I witnessed the fear and anguish caused by the constant threat of deportation. People simply stop focusing on basic aspects of life, like putting food on the table or helping their children improve their grades, and instead start planning on, for the worst case scenario. They wake up every day with one overwhelming priority. If I am detained today, who will take care of my kids? Who will ensure they have a home, food, basic stability? So they have to live with the need to tell their children every day, this may be the day we are separated for years, decades, maybe forever. I mean, can you imagine living with the fear that today might be the last day you see your kids? It's like preparing for a kind of death, and that's what millions of people are going through at the moment.
Eduardo, what's the mood like in Mexico since the elections?
Well, I would say there's several flavors of freak out, but it's generally freak out would be the word there in all of them. Mexicans would have preferred Kamala Harris to win the election. Polls in Mexico had her at 2/3 of Mexicans wanted her to win. But now that Trump has won, well, it's a question of, how hard will the Trump administration hit? Is it a tropical storm, or in the words of an academic in San Diego I was speaking to the other day, a Category 5 hurricane? So what one hears from right now from the government of President Claudia Sheinbaum, it seems like they're trying to reassure the public that this is not going to be so devastating. Kind of like the argument goes, well, we knew how to manage Trump in the past. The presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador managed to coexist with Trump without serious damage to the bilateral relationship. And so even though Trump says very crazy things, he ultimately just wants to cut a deal. So you can, so disregard the maximalist rhetoric that we're hearing from him and just think that there's a deal in the offing and then that we will be skillful enough to do that. There are others, however, that think that that is a foolhardy view of what's coming down the pike, that in fact, Trump is much more emboldened in this second administration than he was in the first. So it depends on whose scenario is right. I tend to side with the second. And regardless of which one you prefer, you can see three kind of boxes of threat that Mexico now faces. The first is what León was talking about a moment ago, the idea of mass deportations, not only of Mexicans, but also of non-Mexicans. And many of these come from countries that will not take their migrants back from the United States. So there is a high probability that Trump will likely force Mexico to take, not only back many migrants from Mexico, but also millions of migrants perhaps from Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, and so forth. So that is one immediate large challenge.
So, Eduardo, let's talk a little bit about the human concept, because I think, what you laid out there, the potential of deporting migrants who are coming across from not even Mexican citizens. How is that even being conceived of or thought of in Mexico, if that were to come to pass? If Trump makes good on these threats and is able to pull off even a portion of what he's promising to do in terms of deporting people, what do you think that would look like for Mexico?
Well, I would say that, Mexico already in the past has accepted the idea that the United States would return non-Mexicans to Mexico. It happened in the first administration, where the Remain in Mexico program was in effect, under which Mexico kept a bunch of migrants from Central America while their cases were heard in U.S. courts. They would return to Mexico and be housed there until their case was decided in the United States. And then the Biden administration negotiated with López Obrador a deal for many Cubans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuelans to be expelled, returned to Mexico. I mean, I think so far the effect on the Mexican economy has probably been positive. I mean, Mexico also has an aging labor force, and you can see problems in its labor market that could be assisted by more migrant workers. The thing is that Mexico is not accustomed to a lot of immigration. The foreign-born population of Mexico is 2%. It's a very, very small number. Mexico has not been a migrant receiving country in its recent history, at least. And the idea that of 11 million people or whatever, maybe 5 million people being expelled abruptly over a course of a year or two, I'm sure that will be immensely disruptive in Mexico, and probably very politically challenging for the government, because you'll have Mexicans that were not really paying a lot of attention to migration. Well, when their communities are suddenly, awash in people from other countries, this might become a political liability for the government.
León, any thoughts on that, about how Mexico would deal with something like that?
For me, what's crucial to understand at the moment is that Mexico is simply not prepared for what's coming. It is not prepared to handle pressure from the south, and it is unprepared as well for a massive wave of deportations from the north. And this lack of preparation was already evident, like Eduardo was saying, during the López Obrador years, when shelters and infrastructure, both in Mexico's southern border and its northern border, were quite literally pushed to their limits. It resulted in brutal tragedies, like the 2023 fire at the Tijuana detention center, where 40 migrants died. And the situation hasn't improved since then in the least. For me, what's even more concerning, Damir, is that Mexico's current government seems unwilling to address these challenges. I'll give you a very specific example. Next year's budget has just been announced, and immigration-related agencies have faced severe funding cuts. For example, the National Migration Institute, basically Mexico's immigration law enforcement agency, saw a 14% reduction. The commission responsible for refugees suffered a 10% cut. So, I mean, if you follow the money, i.e. public funding, Mexico is not prepared, nor does it seem willing to prepare, despite these recent reassurances to Donald Trump that cooperation on immigration will be absolute and forthcoming. So I'm very concerned.
Mm.
The strategy, in fact, León, has been much more repressive than welcoming of migrants in Mexico, right? When the Mexican government decided to help the Biden administration by reducing pressure on the U.S. border starting in December last year, basically what it started doing was grabbing migrants in the north of the country and just sending them south to the south of the country without providing any sort of assistance, basically to make their travel more difficult and make them more unlikely to reach the northern border.
Yes.
So it's been a very, very repressive strategy that Mexico has deployed, and I don't think that the current government is thinking in any way differently.
Mm-hmm. So, obviously, you both know very well that, like it or not, though, this is a political topic in the United States, and partly why Trump was elected. I mean, you just mentioned, Eduardo, the Biden administration and sort of trying to meet them halfway. Were there any policies that the Biden administration did that were smart and were working? Do you guys think that there is any sort of problem even underlying it? Are there any people that ought to be deported in this in the context?
Gosh, that's a complicated question, but in terms of whether the Biden administration did some effective things, I would argue that yes. I think the idea to try to offer incentives to channel migrants to come to border crossings rather than try to come across the border between border crossings and evade the border patrol, I think that was a good thing that would organize people seeking asylum and so that they would come through legal channels. To the extent that it worked or not, well, right now the numbers of migrants reaching the U.S. border is much lower than it was a year ago. However, I do think that this was mostly the doing of the Mexican government in stopping migrants along the way in Mexico. And that's not a question of incentives. That's just deploying the National Guard, grabbing the migrants, putting them into the bus, and sending them back south. So quite a blunt kind of approach.
Yeah. León, any thoughts on that broad question?
I agree with Eduardo that when you talk to migrants, what you hear is that Mexico has become a minefield, has become really, really dangerous. I mean, large parts of the country are under control of organized crime. Authorities are colluded, and people are risking their lives. And there's an actual system of extortion and sexual slavery. So that's when I shudder, when I think about what might be in store for Mexico and for millions of people, not only those coming from the south, but those coming from the north. Can you imagine, Damir, the kind of danger that a business owner, undocumented business owner, like a man from Oaxaca that I met in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, who had built a family, had 2 American kids, but was indeed undocumented. But, had built a business. What kind of danger that person would hypothetically face if deported to Mexico, if he falls in this vortex of crime, this system of extortion that is now in place in Mexico. The country is simply not preparing to protect their own citizens, let alone those other immigrants, like Eduardo has just has said, that are not Mexican and might end up, like so many have in the past, in Mexican territory.
Mm. Well, I want to get into a number of other topics, including trade and the war on drugs, but we'll do that right after the break. Welcome back. I'm Damir Marusic, and this is Impromptu. So, Mexico got a new president this year, Claudia Sheinbaum. After Trump threatened the 25% tariff on Mexican imports, she and Trump had a call last week where they both claimed to have gotten their way. What do we even make of that outcome?
Well, there was a sigh of relief in Mexico when Trump issued that tweet about, how lovely the conversation had gone with President Sheinbaum in Mexico and how she had solved the problem for him. But of course, in the details, you'd see, well, Trump said that she promised to stop all migration, probably at the southern Mexican border, while she was saying we're not promising to stop migration. So evidently there's a hole there between the two people's understanding of what went on. And I bet you that a lot of problems are going to get through that hole. So those 25% in tariffs, which would be truly devastating for the Mexican economy, are still very much on the table. And it's just important to know just how important exports to the United States are for Mexico. 80% of Mexico's exports come to the United States, and they account for about a third of Mexico's GDP.
And León, you were talking earlier about how the Mexican government has failed in many ways in the last 4 years. How do you think the Sheinbaum administration will handle Trump, and how should she?
Well, you're already seeing, Damir, some differences in North America, right? Justin Trudeau flew to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump, have dinner with him. When reporters asked Claudia Sheinbaum when she would do something similar, when she would meet with Trump, she basically said, in due time. I think it's very important to realize that there's a real ideological divide between these two people. I mean, Sheinbaum is a real leftist. López Obrador wasn't really a leftist. He was basically a statist populist, among other things. But Sheinbaum comes from a tradition of the Latin American hard left. She has said that she has already asked Donald Trump to end the American embargo on Cuba. So we cannot take that factor off the table because it's important. Listen, my guess is that their bet in Mexico is that Trump is not going to follow through on all the threats he made, that it will turn out to be just electoral rhetoric and not much more. If that doesn't pan out, the bet is that, as López Obrador did before, they will be able to come to an understanding, appease Trump by budging on the issue that matters most to Trump, which is immigration. López Obrador accepted Trump's conditions on the immigration agenda in exchange for Trump letting him do whatever he wanted in Mexico. Yeah, and we should point out that since mistreating immigrants also doesn't imply a political cost in Mexico, sadly, it's possible that the Mexican government will do the same this time. The problem with this narrative is that this is not the same Donald Trump from 2016, nor does Mexico occupy the same place on the American agenda, right? I mean, there are many issues that are fundamental to Trump now, and frankly, even to the Democratic Party as well. If Kamala Harris had won, we would be talking mostly about the same issues, not the same approach, but the same issues: immigration, trade, fentanyl. If the strategy is to appease Trump, I think that will be a serious mistake, but that seems to be the bet, relying on the influence of some Mexican businessmen, for example, close to Trump's circle. It seems like a naive strategy.
Mm. Interesting. I mean, I would say that Mexico is in a much more vulnerable position than it was when López Obrador was making deals with Trump and roughly handling the relationship well.
I agree.
I mean, one thing that I think to note is that now, kind of like even Canada seems to be willing to throw Mexico under the bus. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw there were these words from Justin Trudeau the other day that said that, you know, we like the U.S. MCA deal between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, but, you know, he said, like, pending decisions and choices that Mexico had made, they might have to look for other options. So, I mean, there's a willingness even by the Canadians to just cut Mexico off, because Canada is also kind of like worried that China is going to like set up shop in Mexico and invade the Canadian market. So the Trumpian rhetoric is like kind of even infecting Justin Trudeau's speak. And so Mexico is looking quite isolated, like sort of like hanging in the wind there, very vulnerable to Trump's tactics.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting what you said there. That's what Trumpism does. It like to the international system, it makes little transactional bilateralists of all of us, right? And it just destroys the idea of positive sum win-win solutions anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
You know, Trump often likes to sort of put the border crisis, the migrant crisis, and the fentanyl crisis in one bucket. It was really remarkable that during the Republican primaries, there was almost a consensus, if not actually a full consensus, about sending troops over the border to fight drugs. Is that on anyone's radar as a possibility, or is that just written off as a complete campaign stunt?
No, absolutely, it's on the radar. The guys that were making these claims are now in the administration. I mean, you know, the guy that Trump wants to be his defense secretary is talking about really lighting the fuse under Mexico. I mean, and he specifically spoke of precision strikes. Then this guy, Tom Homan, who's going to be the immigration czar, he says, you know, hey, President Trump should call the drug cartels terrorist organizations so then he can send special forces after them. I mean, these are people that, if they're confirmed by the Senate, would be designing this policy. Mike Waltz, his national security pick, introduced legislation that would allow the use of military force against the cartels in Mexico. And this is with or without acquiescence by the Mexican government. I don't know, that does inspire a my goodness, like, where have we come to kind of thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that in general, in Mexico, and not only in Mexico, in the United States and elsewhere, people are underestimating how radical this Trump administration is going to be. I mean, if personnel is policy, Eduardo just offered a list that, I mean, you could add Stephen Miller. I always, you know, remember that Miller was Jeff Sessions' right-hand man. And Jeff Sessions was the most anti-immigrant senator in the modern history of the United States Senate. So when you surround yourself with these people, when these people have been thinking about these specific measures, in these areas, and again, we go back to trade, immigration, transnational crime, the fentanyl crisis, there's a very specific agenda. What are the incentives for moderation? I don't see any incentives for moderation. If he acts in the most radical fashion in all three areas, he will be rewarded politically, because in the polls you can see that a majority of Americans support harsh policies in all three areas. And I think that those who think that Trump will moderate himself, again, are being naive.
Well, perhaps, I mean, but what you say, Leon, offers kind of like perhaps a little window of opportunity for rational thought here, because there might be a political rationale for Trump to be less extreme than he seems. So, I mean, just consider that like half of U.S. imports of vegetables and fruits come from Mexico. So a 25% tariff on all of that, if it comes to happen, is going to immediately stoke inflation in foodstuffs and in supermarkets. And this might have, I mean, inflation, as we have seen over the last a couple of years, is very, very powerful politically. And so if there comes to a moment where people that were perhaps marginal Trump voters or whatnot start seeing that the economic outlook is looking more dire because of the tariffs, well, perhaps there would be a political cost that could constrain Trump. I mean, imagine just migrants are 5% of the U.S. labor force, roughly. You don't do away with 5% of your labor force without substantial economic damage.
Unless you do. I think they factored all this in, honestly. At least part of the administration, the incoming administration has. If you listen to Bannon, if you listen to J.D. Vance, what's really behind these plans when it comes to immigration, when it comes to trade, the deep nativism that's behind all this, what's behind America First, what kind of changes these people really want to do transcend 4 years, transcend short term. I'm not being an alarmist. I just listen to these people, and I'm betting that they will do what they've been saying they want to do for the reasons they want to do them. A deep transformation with a capital T. And that, I think, has factored in all the economic hardship of deportation, which would destroy industries in the United States. We've written about this at length in the Post. Of course, tariffs would hurt the American consumer, but there's a larger play here, at least if you believe these people and take them at their word.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, this was a sobering and really important conversation. Thank you both for joining us here for this episode of Impromptu.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.
Before you go, here's a quick word from our humor columnist, Alexandra Petri.
Hurry! We've got to get our shopping done. It's almost tariff season, when the price of everything that relies to any degree on imports shoots sky high. All the urgency of Black Friday, combined with having to rapidly learn macroeconomics. I already knew about tariffs because I'm a Benjamin Harrison aficionado, and the Harrison era was characterized by a big emphasis on economic protectionism. In fact, 23rd President Benjamin Harrison had two pet opossums named Mr. Reciprocity and Mr. Protection. He was so committed to tariffs that he named his pet opossum after one. Other than as a name for your opossum, though, I think tariffs are not a great idea. Our economy is even more globally interconnected than Benjamin Harrison's was. But I guess the Trump team saw that the rising cost of eggs had driven people to the polls, and they thought, we can do this one better. Let's make the cost of everything go up. Just think how many people will vote for Trump then. Look, we import something like 90% of our tomatoes from Mexico, at least according to the AI poisoned hellscape that's been my recent attempts to Google this statistic. So with these tariffs on the horizon, we're trying to do for tomatoes what we did for toilet paper during the early weeks of the pandemic lockdown. In the sense that we're rushing to purchase them while we still can, not in the sense that we're doing any of the other toilet paper things with them. They're much too precious for that. Unfortunately, unlike toilet paper, you cannot just store tomatoes under your bathroom sink until you need them. Well, you can, but you will be disappointed. Like if you voted for Trump, hoping he would drive prices down.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson, edited by Chris Sulentrop and Allison Michaels, and mixed by Emma Munger. Chris Rucan designed our art, Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. How would you advise President Trump on the border? Tell us your ideas at impromptu@washpost.com. And if you're liking the show, we always appreciate a good review on your favorite podcast app.